The morning after my husband died, I made 2 cups of coffee by mistake. That was the moment I realized grief wasn't loud the way people imagine it. It wasn't screaming or collapsing to the floor. It was quiet, mechanical. It was pouring cream into a second mug before remembering the man who drank it was never coming home again. Thomas Harper had been my husband for 33 years. For more than half my life, his footsteps had filled the spaces between my thoughts. He was the kind of man who warmed up my car during Boston winters before I left for work. The kind who folded grocery bags neatly because he said waste bothered him. The kind who kissed my forehead every night even after decades of marriage. Then one rainy Tuesday in October, he was simply gone. Just like that. The funeral happened under gray skies that looked heavy enough to collapse onto the church roof. I remember standing beside the casket feeling strangely calm while everyone else cried around me. My sister held my hand. Thomas's old friends spoke about golf trips and fishing weekends. Someone handed me tissues I never used. I stared at the polished wood and kept thinking about how impossible it felt that a human life could fit inside something so small. When the service ended, people hugged me with soft voices and careful eyes. "Call if you need anything. You're strong, Evelyn. Thomas adored you." Then they drove away one by one until the parking lot emptied and only silence remained. That was the part nobody prepared me for. The silence afterward. The world keeps moving with cruel efficiency after someone dies. Grocery stores still open at 8. Bills still arrive in the mail. Neighbors still walk their dogs. Meanwhile, you stand in the kitchen staring at a half-empty bottle of mustard because your husband was the only person who liked it, and suddenly the sight of it breaks your heart. Winter arrived early that year. Snow gathered along the edges of our driveway while I wandered through the house wearing Thomas's old navy cardigan because it still smelled faintly like cedar soap and coffee beans. Every room carried traces of him. His reading glasses remained on the side table beside the recliner. His leather boots sat near the front door exactly where he had left them. Sometimes I caught myself listening for the sound of his cough upstairs or the creak of the floorboards beneath his weight. But the house stayed still. Empty houses have a different kind of cold. It settles into the walls. 3 months after the funeral, I stopped answering phone calls. Friends invited me to dinner, and I lied about being busy. My daughter suggested therapy, but I couldn't imagine sitting in a room describing pain that felt too enormous for language. Most mornings I stayed in bed until noon watching pale sunlight move slowly across the ceiling. I had spent years building a life beside someone, and now I no longer recognized the person left behind. One evening, I opened Thomas's closet searching for one of his sweaters and found a folded note tucked inside an old travel book. His handwriting slanted slightly to the left, uneven and familiar. When we retire, it read, "Let's finally see the world before we get too old to climb mountains." I sat on the bedroom floor holding that piece of paper while snow drifted outside the windows in soft white sheets. Thomas had always wanted to travel. Italy, Morocco, Kenya. Places we talked about while eating takeout Chinese food on Friday nights. Places we kept postponing because there was always more time. Until suddenly there wasn't. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen, opened my laptop, and bought a one-way ticket to Rome. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not my daughter. Not my neighbors. Not even myself, really. It felt less like a decision and more like surrender. I remember staring at the confirmation email while my coffee grew cold beside me. Part of me hoped movement would somehow outrun grief. That if I crossed enough oceans and sat beneath enough foreign skies, maybe the emptiness inside me would finally loosen its grip. 2 weeks later, I stood at Logan Airport with one suitcase, Thomas's photograph tucked inside my passport, and no real plan for what came next. Outside the terminal windows, snowflakes drifted through the dark Boston air like tiny ghosts disappearing before they touched the ground. Rome was beautiful in the way postcards promise it will be. Narrow cobblestone streets curved between weathered buildings draped with flower boxes. Church bells echoed through the mornings, while scooters buzzed past outdoor cafes filled with laughing couples sharing espresso beneath striped umbrellas. Everywhere I looked, people seemed alive in ways I no longer understood. The first morning after arriving, I sat alone at a tiny table overlooking the Piazza Navona while rain misted softly against the old stone fountains. A waiter placed a warm croissant beside my coffee and smiled kindly at me. "First time in Rome?" he asked. I nodded and forced a smile back, but the truth was I barely noticed the city around me. I spent most of my time watching other people instead. Elderly husbands holding their wives' hands while crossing crowded streets. Young families sharing gelato near the Trevi fountain. Tourists arguing gently over maps before laughing and pulling each other close again. Every small moment reminded me of Thomas. He would have loved this place. He would have stopped every 10 feet to photograph old windows or ask strangers about local restaurants. He always believed traveling was less about seeing places and more about understanding people. Without him beside me, the city felt strangely muted, like listening to music through a wall. I stayed in Rome for 12 days before moving on to Istanbul, then Marrakesh, then Mumbai. I drifted through airports and train stations like a ghost carrying the same small suitcase and the same grief from country to country. Friends back home commented on the photos I posted online. "You look amazing. Living the dream. Thomas would be proud of you." What they could not see was how often I cropped myself out of the pictures afterward because I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. In Istanbul, I rented a small apartment overlooking the Bosphorus. Every evening, the call to prayer rolled across the city in long haunting waves while fishing boats moved slowly through the dark water below. One night, I sat near the window eating lentil soup from a paper container when I realized I had not spoken to another human being. In nearly 3 days, the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt dangerous. There is a particular loneliness that comes from constantly moving. Nobody expects anything from you because nobody knows you long enough to care. I began sleeping poorly. Some nights I woke convinced I had heard Thomas turning pages beside me in bed. Other nights I reached for my phone just to hear a familiar voice, then stopped myself before making the call. I did not know how to explain this emptiness to people who still lived normal lives with grocery lists and dinner reservations and husbands waiting at home. By the time I reached Morocco, I had started wondering if grief was less like a wound and more like a country you accidentally immigrate to. One where everything familiar suddenly feels foreign forever. Marrakesh overwhelmed me at first. The air smelled of spices, smoke, and dust baked beneath relentless heat. Motorcycles squeezed through crowded alleyways while merchants called out prices from colorful market stalls overflowing with woven rugs and brass lanterns. One afternoon, I wandered into a quiet courtyard cafe hidden behind heavy wooden doors. The owner brought me minty in a glass decorated with gold paint and asked where I was from. "Boston," I answered. He smiled warmly. Cold city." Then he pointed gently toward my wedding ring. "And your husband?" I stared down at the untouched tea between my hands. For a moment, I could not speak. Finally, I said the words I still hated hearing aloud. "He passed away." The man lowered his eyes respectfully. "I am sorry," he said softly. When someone we love leaves this world, sometimes our soul keeps searching for them everywhere. That sentence followed me for weeks afterward. Because that was exactly what I had been doing. Searching. In crowded airports. In foreign skylines. In strangers' voices. In hotel rooms that never smelled like home. But no amount of movement changed the truth waiting for me every morning when I opened my eyes. Thomas was still gone. And I was still painfully alone. Nearly 8 months after leaving Boston, I found myself sitting inside a tiny airport terminal in Nairobi holding a last-minute ticket to northern Kenya. I had not planned to go there. In truth, I barely knew anything about the region at all. But something about the worn photograph on the travel brochure caught my attention. A small village beneath an enormous orange sky. Children smiling despite bare feet and dusty clothes. The image stayed with me for reasons I could not explain. An hour later, I boarded a narrow propeller plane carrying only 12 passengers and watched the city disappear beneath the clouds while the African landscape stretched endlessly below like another planet. The plane landed on a narrow dirt runway surrounded by endless stretches of dry red earth. Heat shimmered above the ground in slow waves as I stepped down carrying my suitcase into air so hot it felt almost solid against my skin. There was no airport terminal like the ones I was used to. Just a small concrete building with faded paint and a rusted metal roof humming beneath the afternoon sun. A young driver holding a handwritten sign with my name approached me quietly and offered a polite smile before taking my bag. During the drive north, I pressed my forehead against the dusty window while the landscape unfolded around us in silence. Small villages appeared every few miles. Children walked barefoot beside the road balancing yellow water containers larger than their torsos. Women carried bundles of wood on their heads with astonishing grace. Goats wandered between crumbling market stalls while thin dogs slept beneath patches of shade. Everything felt far removed from the polished travel brochures I had seen online. This was not the Africa of luxury safaris and rooftop resorts. This was survival. We arrived at the village shortly before sunset. The sky had turned deep orange, stretching endlessly above clusters of small clay homes scattered across the dry earth. The clinic where I was staying stood near the edge of the village, beside a crooked acacia tree. It was little more than a long concrete building with peeling paint and 2 dim solar lights near the entrance. I could hear coughing from inside before I even stepped out of the truck. Dr. Miriam Ndlova greeted me warmly despite obvious exhaustion lining her face. She was a woman perhaps in her late 40s with tired eyes that somehow still carried extraordinary kindness. "You are welcome here," she said softly while leading me through the clinic. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic, dust, and smoke drifting in from outdoor cooking fires. Every bed was occupied. Mothers sat beside sick children using folded cloth to cool their foreheads. An elderly man slept upright in a plastic chair because there were no empty cots left. A young nurse moved quickly between patients beneath the weak glow of battery-powered lamps. I felt suddenly embarrassed by the expensive hiking boots on my feet and the heavy camera hanging from my shoulder. That first night, I barely slept. The sounds outside were unfamiliar. Insects hummed endlessly in the darkness, while distant voices carried through the warm night air. Around midnight, I heard hurried footsteps outside my room followed by urgent voices speaking in a language I could not understand. By morning, I learned a little girl had collapsed near the village well during the night from severe dehydration and fever. Her name was Amara. I saw her later that afternoon lying quietly on a narrow bed near the back of the clinic. She could not have been older than 8. Her arms looked painfully thin beneath the faded yellow blanket covering her body. Yet when she noticed me standing awkwardly nearby, she managed a small smile anyway. That smile broke something open inside me. Samuel Okoro found me sitting alone outside the clinic shortly afterward. He worked with the local outreach team and spoke with the calm, steady voice of someone used to carrying difficult truths. He handed me a cup of tea before sitting beside me beneath the tree. "First day is always hard," he said gently. I stared toward the horizon where the evening light painted everything gold. I knew poverty existed, I admitted quietly. But I do not think I truly understood it. Samuel nodded slowly. Most people do not. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he pointed toward the clinic behind us where tired mothers waited silently beside their children. "Most people here do not die from terrible disasters," he said. "They die from things the rest of the world stopped noticing. Dirty water, infection, heat, hunger, being forgotten." I felt tears rise before I could stop them. Not dramatic tears. Not loud sobbing. Just silent tears slipping down my face while the sky darkened above us. For months I had been drowning in my own grief so completely that I forgot suffering existed outside myself. Yet here were people carrying burdens far heavier than mine and still finding reasons to smile at strangers. That night, I opened my suitcase searching for clean clothes and found Thomas's photograph tucked inside my passport holder. I sat on the narrow bed staring at his familiar face beneath the soft glow of a lantern while distant laughter drifted through the village outside. Then for the first time since his death, a strange thought entered my mind. Maybe I had not come all this way to escape my pain after all. Maybe somehow, without realizing it, I had come here to finally understand it. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of roosters somewhere beyond the village and the low murmur of women speaking outside my window. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the heat settled around me, thick even in the early morning darkness, and I remembered the red earth, the crowded clinic, and the little girl named Amara smiling at me through fever. I dressed quietly and stepped outside just as the first light began spreading across the horizon in soft shades of gold and pale pink. Smoke curled upward from cooking fires while children carried metal buckets toward the well in sleepy silence. Everything moved slowly here, not because life was easy, but because energy had to be protected carefully. Even the air itself seemed tired beneath the weight of the heat. I found Dr. Miriam already awake inside the clinic sorting small boxes of medical supplies onto a wooden table. Most of the labels were faded. Some boxes were nearly empty. She glanced up when I entered and smiled gently. "You do not have to help," she said. "You are a guest." But standing there watching her work alone while exhausted mothers waited outside felt unbearable. "Show me what to do," I replied. That became my routine almost without realizing it. In the mornings, I helped boil water over outdoor stoves or folded clean bandages beside the nurses. Sometimes I carried crates from supply trucks. Other times I simply sat beside frightened children while Dr. Miriam treated them. I was not a doctor. I could not cure disease or erase hunger. But I slowly began understanding something Thomas used to say whenever neighbors needed help back home. "Most people do not need miracles," he would tell me. "They just need someone willing to stay." One afternoon, I walked nearly 2 miles with several women from the village to collect water from a distant pump after the nearby well stopped working again. The sun pressed down mercilessly while dust coated my shoes and clung to my skin. Yet the women laughed together during the entire walk. They teased one another, shared stories, balanced heavy containers on their heads with impossible strength. At one point, an older woman reached over and adjusted the scarf slipping from my shoulders as if I belonged there beside them. That small gesture nearly brought me to tears. In Boston, grief had made me invisible. People spoke carefully around me, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Friends stopped calling after months passed because they assumed I should be recovering by then. But here, nobody expected me to pretend I was healed. Pain was simply part of life, shared openly, carried together. One evening, Samuel sat beside me outside the clinic while children chased each other through the fading sunlight nearby. Amara was among them now, still thin but laughing loudly while kicking a worn soccer ball through the dust. "You look different," Samuel observed quietly. I stared toward the horizon where the sky burned orange behind distant trees. "Do I?" He nodded once. "When you arrived, it looked like your spirit was somewhere very far away." I thought about that after he left. Back in Boston, my days had blurred together into endless silence and memory. Here, every hour demanded my attention. There was always someone needing water, medicine, comfort, or simply another pair of hands. Exhaustion replaced emptiness. Purpose slowly replaced despair. That night, while organizing donated clothing inside a storage room, I found myself laughing unexpectedly at something one of the nurses said. The sound startled me so much I stopped moving altogether. It was the first real laugh I had heard from myself in nearly a year. Later, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at Thomas's photograph again. The lantern beside me flickered softly while insects hummed outside in the darkness. "You would have loved these people," I whispered quietly. For the first time since his death, speaking to him did not feel like reopening a wound. It felt warm somehow, like carrying him forward instead of clinging desperately to what I had lost. I thought grief meant learning how to live without the person you loved. But maybe grief was really learning how to let their love continue changing you even after they were gone. Outside, distant laughter drifted through the village beneath a sky overflowing with stars brighter than any I had ever seen back home. And somewhere in the middle of that warm African night, surrounded by people who owned almost nothing yet still shared everything they had, I realized I no longer wanted to keep running from my life. 3 weeks passed before I finally understood how fragile life in the village truly was. At first, I only noticed the obvious things. The cracked walls of the clinic, the shortage of medicine, the exhaustion in Dr. Miriam's eyes. But slowly, deeper problems revealed themselves in quiet, devastating ways. One morning, I watched a young mother pour cloudy brown water from a plastic container into a cooking pot while her little boy sat nearby scratching dry patches on his arms. Another afternoon, I followed several children walking nearly 4 miles beneath brutal heat to reach the nearest working well after the village pump failed again. The smallest child could not have been older than 6, yet she carried a yellow container almost half her size without complaint. I kept thinking about the kitchen sink back in Boston. Clean water flowing endlessly with the turn of a handle. Here, survival itself demanded hours of labor every single day. One evening, a violent thunderstorm rolled across the region, drenching the dry earth so quickly that water flooded the narrow dirt paths between homes. The rain lasted only 2 hours, but afterward the clinic filled with sick children suffering from contaminated water and infection. I spent most of the night helping nurses clean beds and carry supplies while exhausted mothers sat awake beside feverish children beneath flickering lantern light. Around midnight, I stepped outside for air and found Dr. Miriam leaning against the clinic wall staring into the darkness. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof beside her. She looked older somehow, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age. "How do you keep doing this?" I asked quietly. She gave a tired smile without looking at me. "You stop asking whether it is fair," she replied. "You simply wake up every morning and continue." We stood there listening to distant thunder rumble across the plains. Then after a long silence, she added softly, "The hardest part is watching people lose hope before they lose anything else." That sentence stayed with me for days. Because I had seen it already. Not despair exactly. Something quieter. Resignation. Parents who no longer believed clean water or electricity or proper medicine would ever come to their village. Children who grew up expecting hunger as naturally as weather. Even the clinic itself operated with a kind of exhausted acceptance. Broken solar panels remained unrepaired for months because nobody believed funding would arrive. Medical equipment sat useless without replacement parts. Dreams had become luxuries people could no longer afford. One afternoon, Samuel brought me to a hill overlooking the village just before sunset. From there, I could see the entire region spread beneath the enormous sky. Small homes scattered across red earth. Women walking long distances with water containers balanced carefully on their heads. Thin columns of smoke rising from evening fires. It was beautiful in a heartbreaking way. "Do you know what most visitors say when they come here?" Samuel asked. I shook my head. "They say this place is sad." He looked toward the village below and smiled faintly. "But this is our home. People still fall in love here. Children still laugh. Families still pray together. We are poor, yes, but we are not empty." I felt ashamed then for how often I had viewed these people only through the lens of suffering. There was dignity here too. Strength. Humanity. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the children carrying water beneath the blazing sun and the mothers waiting patiently beside crowded clinic beds. Around 2 in the morning, I opened my laptop for the first time in weeks and logged into my bank account. The numbers on the screen suddenly felt unreal. Thomas's retirement savings. The investment account we barely touched. The money sitting untouched while people here struggled for things most Americans never think twice about. I remembered all the years Thomas spent carefully planning for a future we never got to live together. Travel plans. Lake cabins. Cruises through Alaska. Comfortable retirement dinners overlooking the ocean somewhere. Tears filled my eyes as I stared at his name attached to the account. Then suddenly, I heard his voice in my memory as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. Money only matters if it changes somebody's life. He used to say that whenever he donated quietly to neighbors in trouble back home. I closed the laptop slowly and sat there listening to insects hum beyond the window screen while warm African wine drifted through the darkness. By sunrise, my decision had already been made. Later that morning, I found Samuel repairing a broken supply shelf outside the clinic. "What would it cost to build a reliable water system here?" I asked. He stopped what he was doing and stared at me in stunned silence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then very carefully, almost as if he was afraid hope itself might disappear if spoken too loudly, he asked, "Are you serious?" I looked toward the village where children were already beginning another long walk beneath the rising heat. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I think I finally am." The news spread through the village faster than I expected. By the following afternoon, people who had barely spoken more than polite greetings to me before were stopping outside the clinic to smile or wave as I passed. Children followed me through the dusty paths, calling out my name in excited voices, while elderly women pressed my hands warmly between theirs. It embarrassed me at first, because I had not actually done anything yet. There were no new wells, no pipes, no clean water flowing through the village. Only a promise sitting quietly between Samuel and me beneath that acacia tree. But here, even hope itself carried weight. Over the next several weeks, my days became filled with meetings, paperwork, and endless conversations beneath the brutal heat. Samuel introduced me to local engineers from a nearby town who surveyed the land and tested underground water sources. Dr. Miriam helped organize records showing how many illnesses were connected to contaminated water. Some evenings, we sat around a rough wooden table inside the clinic surrounded by maps and handwritten notes while insects tapped softly against the lantern glass beside us. It felt strangely familiar in a way I could not explain. Like building something meaningful alongside people who genuinely cared. Like being alive again. One morning, Samuel drove me nearly 60 miles to the nearest city so I could purchase additional medical supplies and equipment for the clinic. The roads were rough and uneven, forcing the truck to bounce violently through deep ruts carved into the earth by years of rain and drought. At one point, we passed a group of children waving excitedly beside the roadside while herding goats beneath the blazing sun. Samuel smiled and waved back before glancing toward me. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most visitors only stay long enough to take photographs." I looked out the dusty window at the endless landscape rolling past us. "Maybe I was that kind of visitor once," I admitted quietly. He nodded as though he understood exactly what I meant. During the drive home, Samuel told me more about his own childhood. His father had died when he was young, leaving his mother to raise 4 children alone while working long days selling vegetables at outdoor markets. There were years when school fees became impossible to afford, years when drought nearly destroyed entire communities nearby. Yet somehow, listening to him describe those hardships, I noticed he never spoke with bitterness. Only honesty. My mother used to say suffering becomes dangerous when it convinces you that nobody sees you anymore, he told me while keeping his eyes on the road ahead. That is why kindness matters here so much. Even small kindness. That sentence lingered inside me long after the conversation ended. Because back in Boston, after Thomas died, I had slowly convinced myself my life no longer mattered either. Grief had narrowed my world until all I could see was absence. But here, surrounded by people carrying burdens far heavier than mine, I was beginning to understand how healing sometimes arrives quietly through usefulness. Through service. Through simply being needed by someone again. The construction for the new water system finally began at the start of the dry season. Villagers gathered early each morning to help clear land and carry materials beneath the rising heat. Some people walked miles just to volunteer for a few hours before returning home to care for their families. I joined them whenever I could despite Samuel repeatedly warning me about the temperature. By noon each day, my clothes clung to my skin with sweat and red dust coated my arms, shoes, and hair. Yet I had not felt this physically exhausted in years. Or this emotionally awake. One afternoon, while workers dug trenches near the clinic, Amara appeared beside me carrying a small woven bracelet decorated with blue and white beads. Without speaking, she slipped it gently around my wrist before smiling shyly. "For good luck," Samuel translated softly from nearby. I stared at the bracelet for several seconds, suddenly unable to speak. In America, I had spent months surrounded by sympathy after Thomas died. Flowers. Cards. Condolences whispered politely over casseroles and phone calls. But somehow this tiny bracelet given by a child who owned almost nothing touched me more deeply than any of it. That night, after dinner, The villagers gathered near a fire beneath the stars while someone played music on an old weathered guitar missing one string. Children danced barefoot in the dust while women clapped softly beside them. Samuel handed me a cup of sweet tea before sitting nearby. "You are smiling more now," he observed quietly. I looked around at the faces glowing warmly beneath the firelight and realized he was right. For the first time in nearly a year, I no longer woke each morning dreading another empty day. Grief still existed inside me. Thomas was still gone. But somehow, among these people and beneath this enormous African sky, sorrow no longer felt like the only thing left in my life. The sickness arrived quietly at first. A few children developed fevers after heavy rainstorms flooded parts of the village again. Then several elderly residents became too weak to walk long distances for water. Within days, the clinic overflowed with patients lying side by side beneath slowly turning ceiling fans that barely pushed the heavy heat around the room. Dr. Miriam worked nearly without sleep while nurses moved constantly between beds carrying bowls of water, medicine, and damp cloths. The unfinished water system stood nearby like a promise still waiting to become real. Every morning, I woke before sunrise and helped however I could. Some days I prepared food for exhausted families waiting outside the clinic. Other days I sat beside frightened children while Dr. Miriam examined them. Time blurred into long, humid hours filled with coughing, whispered prayers, and the endless creaking sound of the old clinic doors opening and closing. Yet even in the middle of exhaustion, nobody complained. That was what unsettled me most. People here had learned how to endure suffering so completely that hardship no longer surprised them. One afternoon, I noticed Amara sitting unusually still outside beneath the acacia tree. Normally, she followed workers around asking endless questions or laughing with other children nearby. But that day, her face looked pale and tired beneath the heat. When I touched her forehead gently, fear tightened immediately in my chest. Her skin burned with fever. Dr. Miriam examined her quickly before guiding her toward one of the narrow beds near the back wall. "She is very dehydrated," she said, quietly while preparing medication. "We caught it early, but we must watch her carefully tonight." Something inside me froze at those words. I sat beside Amara for hours while the clinic buzzed softly around us. Every time she stirred beneath the blanket, I felt panic rise unexpectedly inside me. It startled me how quickly this child had become important to me. Perhaps because grief changes the shape of love rather than destroying it. Perhaps because after losing Thomas, some wounded part of me could not bear the thought of losing another person I cared about. That night, rain hammered the metal roof while lantern light flickered weakly across the crowded clinic walls. Samuel found me sitting beside Amara long after midnight with untouched tea cooling beside my chair. "You should rest," he said gently. I shook my head immediately. "I am fine." He studied my face quietly before pulling another chair beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Rainwater dripped steadily through a leak near the entrance, while distant thunder rolled across the dark plains outside. Finally, Samuel glanced toward the sleeping children surrounding us. "You know," he said softly, "when my younger sister became sick years ago, my mother stayed awake beside her bed for 4 nights. I looked toward him. "Did she recover?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." But my mother said something afterward I never forgot. He paused briefly before continuing. "She said love is terrifying because once you care deeply for someone, fear becomes part of your life forever." I stared down at Amara's small hand resting weakly above the blanket. Samuel was right. Losing Thomas had not removed my capacity to love. It had only made me afraid of how fragile love truly is. Around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I rested my head briefly against the wall beside Amara's bed. I dreamed of Thomas standing beside the ocean wearing the old gray sweater he loved every winter. He was smiling quietly at me the way he always did when words were unnecessary. When I woke suddenly before dawn, the clinic was silent except for soft breathing and distant rain. For one terrible second, panic surged through me. Before I looked toward Amara and saw her eyes open. She smiled weakly the moment she noticed me awake beside her. Relief hit me so powerfully that tears immediately filled my eyes. I reached for her hand carefully while she drifted back to sleep beneath the soft morning light beginning to creep through the dusty windows. Outside, workers were already gathering near the construction site, despite the storm damage from the night before. Life continued here no matter what happened. Sorrow, illness, loss, hope. Everything existed side by side beneath the same enormous sky. Later that morning, while standing alone outside the clinic watching sunlight slowly dry the soaked earth, I realized something that changed me forever. Grief never truly disappears. It does not fade cleanly or vanish with time the way people promise it will. Instead, it changes shape. It softens in some places and deepens in others. But if you allow it to, grief can also open your heart wider than it was before. Wide enough to carry other people's pain alongside your own. And standing there beneath the warm African sun, listening to children laughing softly somewhere behind me despite everything they had endured, I understood that maybe healing was never about forgetting what you lost. Maybe it was about learning how to keep loving the world anyway. By the end of the dry season, the village no longer looked the same. Long trenches stretched across the red earth where new water lines had been buried beneath the ground. Fresh solar panels gleamed beside the clinic roof, catching sunlight that once disappeared uselessly into endless heat. Workers moved steadily between construction sites carrying tools and pipes, while children gathered nearby after school to watch everything with wide, curious eyes. Some mornings, I stood quietly beneath the acacia tree with coffee warming my hands and barely recognized the place compared to the exhausted village I first arrived in months earlier. The changes were not dramatic in the way movies portray transformation. There were no giant celebrations or miraculous overnight solutions. Progress happened slowly here. Pipe by pipe. Light bulb by light bulb. Small. Victories stitched together through patience and relentless effort. Yet those small victories changed daily life in ways I could physically see. Women no longer walked miles before sunrise carrying heavy water containers across dangerous roads. Children arrived at the clinic cleaner and healthier. For the first time in years, Dr. Miriam began speaking about expanding medical programs instead of merely surviving one crisis after another. One evening, Samuel and I sat outside the clinic watching workers install the final section of the new water filtration system while warm wind moved softly through the dry grass nearby. "You know what surprises me most?" he asked thoughtfully. I glanced toward him. "What?" He smiled faintly while watching children chase one another beside the construction site. "You came here looking like someone waiting for life to end quietly." His voice remained gentle, without judgment. "Now you wake up every morning asking what else can be improved." I laughed softly at that because it was true. Somewhere between carrying medical supplies, helping with water systems, and sitting beside sick children during long nights, I had stopped measuring my life by what I lost. Purpose had returned so gradually I almost failed to notice it happening. A few weeks later, I flew back to Boston for the first time since leaving nearly a year earlier. The city felt colder than I remembered. Faster too. People hurried through train stations staring down at glowing phone screens while icy wind swept between tall buildings beneath gray skies. I unlocked the front door to my old house and stood silently inside the empty living room while dust drifted through pale afternoon light. Everything remained exactly where I had left it. Thomas's books still lined the shelves. His winter coat still hung near the front entrance. But the grief waiting inside those walls no longer consumed me the same way. For the first time since his death, the house felt like a memory instead of a grave. I spent 3 days sorting through belongings and meeting with lawyers and financial advisors. Some friends thought I was making a terrible mistake when I told them I planned to sell the house and permanently fund projects overseas. "You cannot save everyone," one neighbor warned carefully over coffee. I understood what she meant. But that had never been the point. I was not trying to rescue the world. I was trying to honor the life Thomas and I built together by turning love into something useful after he was gone. Before leaving Boston again, I visited the cemetery alone one quiet afternoon. Snow covered the ground in soft white layers while bare tree branches swayed gently overhead. I stood beside Thomas's grave for a long time with my hands buried deep inside my coat pockets. "I finally understand what you meant," I whispered quietly into the cold air. About money. About people. About what matters. Wind moved softly across the cemetery while distant church bells echoed through the gray afternoon. For the first time, standing there no longer felt like saying goodbye. It felt like carrying him forward with me into whatever came next. When I returned to the village several weeks later, children ran toward the truck before it fully stopped. Amara nearly knocked me over, hugging me while laughing breathlessly. Someone had painted a sign outside the clinic entrance while I was gone. The Thomas Harper Community Health Center. I stared at the words for several seconds, unable to speak. Samuel stood nearby, smiling quietly. The village wanted his name here, he explained. Because none of this would exist without him too. That night, electricity from the new solar system lit the clinic brightly for the first time. Women gathered outside singing softly while children danced barefoot beneath strings of small white lights glowing against the dark African sky. Dr. Miriam stood beside me near the entrance, watching the celebration unfold with tears shining in her tired eyes. For years, she said quietly, we only talked about survival here. Tonight people are talking about the future again. I looked around at the laughter, the lights, the children chasing one another through clouds of red dust beneath the stars, and something warm settled deep inside my chest. Not happiness exactly. Something steadier. Something earned. I had traveled across the world, believing my life ended the day Thomas died. But standing there beneath that enormous sky, surrounded by people who had taught me how to keep loving despite loss, I finally understood that grief had not brought me here to disappear. It had brought me here to begin again. 2 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined possible. Seasons changed across the village in quiet, familiar rhythms I slowly learned by heart. Dry winds arrived carrying red dust that coated the trees and rooftops for weeks at a time. Then rainstorms swept across the plains with sudden violence, turning the earth dark and rich beneath enormous silver skies. Through every season, the village continued changing. The water system expanded beyond the clinic into nearby communities. Additional solar panels powered refrigeration units for medicine that once spoiled in the heat. Children who previously spent hours collecting water each morning now attended school consistently. Some afternoons, I stood near the well listening to laughter echo across the village and thought about how impossible this life would have seemed to the woman I used to be back in Boston. The strangest part was how ordinary everything eventually became. Grief no longer woke me in the middle of the night gasping for memories I could not hold on to. Thomas still existed in my thoughts every single day, but not with the sharp, unbearable ache that once followed me through airports and empty hotel rooms across the world. Instead, he existed in quieter ways now. In the sound of children laughing outside the clinic because electricity allowed evening classes after sunset. In the clean water pouring from taps where women once carried heavy containers for miles beneath crushing heat. In every life touched by kindness, he would have believed in immediately. One afternoon, I sat outside the clinic reviewing supply orders while Amara practiced reading English aloud beside me beneath the shade of the acacia tree. Her voice stumbled carefully over difficult words before suddenly brightening with pride each time she succeeded. She had grown taller over the past 2 years. Stronger too. The fragile, feverish child I met during my first week in the village had become a determined girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor someday. You are smiling again, she announced suddenly while lowering the book into her lap. I laughed softly. Was I not smiling before? Amara shook her head seriously. When you first came here, your eyes looked sad all the time. Like you lost something very important. Children notice truths adults often miss. I looked out toward the horizon where evening sunlight painted the plains gold beneath drifting clouds. I did lose something important, I admitted quietly. But I think maybe I found something too. Amara considered this carefully before nodding once, as if the answer made perfect sense. That evening, Samuel and I drove to a nearby hill overlooking the village after delivering medical supplies to another community farther north. The truck engine clicked softly while cooling beneath the fading heat. Below us, small lights from homes and solar lamps flickered warmly against the darkening earth. Smoke curled upward from cooking fires while distant music drifted faintly through the warm night air. Do you ever miss America? Samuel asked quietly. I thought about the question for a long moment. Of course there were things I missed. Snowfall outside kitchen windows during winter mornings. The smell of coffee shops in Boston. Familiar streets Thomas and I once walked together holding hands. But strangely, those memories no longer pulled me backward with painful longing. They simply existed beside my new life now. Sometimes I answered honestly. But home feels different to me now. Samuel smiled softly without asking me to explain further. He understood. Home was no longer a single place connected to grief and memory. It had become people, purpose, belonging. Before coming here, I believed life moved in straight lines. Marriage, retirement, growing old together. Then Thomas died and shattered the future I thought I understood. For a long time, I mistook that brokenness for the end of my story. But standing there beneath the enormous African sky while warm wind moved through the dry grass around us, I finally understood something grief had spent years trying to teach me. Life does not always continue the way we planned. Sometimes it breaks apart completely. Sometimes love leaves behind silence so deep it feels impossible to survive. Yet even then, the world still offers moments of astonishing beauty if we remain open enough to notice them. A child laughing beside clean water. Lantern light glowing through clinic windows at night. Music drifting across red earth beneath endless stars. Quiet acts of kindness shared between strangers who eventually become family. I traveled across the world believing I was running away from pain. But pain was never the true destination waiting for me. Humanity was. Purpose was. Love was. Not the kind that disappears when someone dies, but the kind that expands beyond loss and keeps shaping lives long after we are gone. As darkness settled gently across the village below, I closed my eyes and listened to the distant sound of children laughing somewhere in the warm night air. And for the first time in many years, my heart no longer felt divided between grief and peace. Somehow, against all odds, both had finally learned how to exist together.